The conversation today is with Fadi Kattan. He's a chef and my friend who lives in the West Bank of Palestine. His restaurant's called Fawda. It's a celebration of Palestinian foodways, and he currently resides in Bethlehem. And as much as I wish this conversation was about the dates and the olives and the oranges that he speaks with such passion from his homeland, instead we're going to be talking about the inhumanity of this moment. On October 7, Hamas conducted an atrocious and evil terrorist attack on Israel, killing over 1,000 Israelis and several hundred were taken as hostages. In response, Israel has relentlessly bombarded Gaza and has murdered over 25,000 Palestinians and continues to do so, violating several international laws. 2 million Palestinians have been displaced. They're now facing food insecurity, water scarcity, and their homes have been completely removed from the face of the earth. At Life Thyme, we make sense of the world through the lens of food and the people behind it. And without people, food is meaningless. That's why I wanted to talk to Fadi, a chef, someone who's in the business of taking care of people, feeding them, bombarding them with hospitality. And this conversation between Fadi and I is to gain an ounce of perspective of what life was like in Palestine before October 7 and now. Here's Fadi. Fadi, how are you, my brother?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. Basically, I just wanted to just have a chat with you. I just want to have a chat with you. This could go in so many different ways. I have my own, questions I want to ask you, but I think we forget about what it means to be human. Like at of the most basic level.
How can a human being, whatever they are, see what's going on in Gaza right now and not feel that this is wrong? You know, when you look at international law and international institutions and the world after the Second World War realized that massive crime is not, shouldn't happen again. But then since then, it's happened on and on and on. I mean, Vietnam, Rwanda, Bosnia, and then there's, you know, maybe here it hits differently for a simple reason, which is first, I'm Palestinian, but um, also because of the centrality of identity for a lot of people across the world that have a certain link to this region, whether it's by their faith or by their ethnic belonging. Um, and then you see crazy stuff. I mean, for me, this was one of the most incomprehensible things when, there's this very powerful image of Mike Pence signing a rocket. It's like, that's where to your thought, I wonder, like, what happens in that person's head when you're actually knowingly signing or writing your name or whatever on an object that will kill people.
Yeah.
Like I don't think. I mean, I am ashamed to say that I am from that same race of humanity
Yeah.
because I'm somebody who believes in nonviolence to the core. I've never believed in any form of violence.
It's preposterous.
If you're an American citizen, regardless of your faith, you could be whatever you want. You
Hmm.
could believe that God is a strawberry, as far as I'm concerned. Your human identity should not be linked to a place like Israel or like anywhere else, like Palestine. I mean, Palestine is not a Muslim cause. It's not a Christian cause. Even though Christianity started here. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm talking to you from 1,000 meters away from the Church of the Nativity. But I would be as much disturbed if all of a sudden American Christians felt that Palestine is a Christian cause. And I I was asked like, but do you think Jewish people in America have to have a role uh, in this situation here? This was before 7th of
Hmm.
October. And I was like, you know what? I think the question is wrong. I think the question by itself is actually racist.
Hmm.
And that's maybe my French upbringing that makes me believe in secularism to the core. But I don't see why somebody's faith should dictate what they're, who they are. And at the same time, I have to admit, because of how things are, not because of how I would like them to be, seeing a lot of these, young Jewish voices for peace, etc., demonstrating a bit all over the world, I think this should push people to stop and think for a second and be like, yeah, actually, all of these people are demonstrating because they're human beings. I just wanted to say it's like our perspective of the world today is like forcing people to identify by their faiths.
Not only by their faith, but they're forcing people to identify to their government, to their political alignment. We should always be critical of our government, for the people in power. I'm here in America and I'm critical of this government, of this country all the time. We should always be critical and hold government power accountable.
You're right. It's like the definition of democracy is that we as citizens work towards voicing our needs and wants and opinions to make government do a better job.
Yeah.
That, for me at least, that's my simple understanding of what democracy should be. When you see 500,000 people demonstrating somewhere, again, for whatever it is, whether it's calling for a ceasefire in Palestine or it's for the right for same sex marriage or whatever, somebody in government should sit back and be like, maybe I should listen to these people. Like maybe there's something there. Maybe I'm actually paid to do my job to represent these people. And that's what I should be doing. That doesn't seem to be the case. The case is, like I don't understand when a politician, whoever they are, says, I'm against a ceasefire. Like a ceasefire, by definition, I think, is to stop firing between two parties that are killing each other.
Mhm.
Like, and if ever I had a one-on-one with any of these people, I would just want to know, but what is the values you're representing when you say you're against stopping people killing each other? Like, that's your basic humanity.
Yeah.
If I see Antonio on the street having a fist fight with somebody, my role as a third citizen would be to stop Antonio and that person beating each other up. The number of people being killed that we've all seen. It's not, it's not a unknown reality. And then you hear people say, "Oh, but we're not sure it's a genocide." It's like, wait, there's 29,000 people dead.
I was looking up, I'm like, what constitutes a genocide? Like, what is the definition of a genocide? So, politics aside, emotions aside, let's just look at this from purely from an international law perspective of what constitutes a genocide. What breaks that law?
The South Africans made it easy. I don't know if you've read the 84 pages they've submitted. I did. Um, there's 9 articles in that act of against genocide that was ratified in 1949. It's there. It's not. We're not reinventing the wheel. It's there. There are measures. There are tangible descriptions of what is a genocide. One of them that is the most difficult usually to prove is the intent to commit genocide.
Mhm.
Over the last 90 something days, we have heard repeatedly on mainstream media, Israeli politicians say what their end goal is in Gaza. We've heard people say we want everybody expelled out of Gaza. We've heard people say flatten down Gaza. We've heard people quote biblical myths to explain what they want to do. I mean, the speech that was done by Netanyahu where he talks about Amalek, being somebody who doesn't believe, I I respect everybody's faith, and I look at texts of faith as stories. When today in 2023, or 2024 today, but it was said in 2023, you have a prime minister of a country that quotes a biblical text and says that is what we should do. And the story is Amalek was somebody who, it was a tribe that massacred a Jewish tribe, and the response was for them to attack the Amalek tribe, and the instructions they were given was kill children, elderly, and everybody else, women, and like that is said on mainstream media. So that article about the intent of committing genocide is there. It's out there. It's on CNN. It's on BBC. It's on Israeli TV channels.
The UN, and I have it right here, the UN Genocide Convention, they define genocide as these five acts: killing members of a national ethnic group, causing them serious bodily or mental harm, imposing living conditions intended to destroy the group, preventing births, and forcibly transferring children out of that group. So, if we take that into context, and like as you said, South Africa has already accused Israel, and they're taking them to the international courts. Um, there's there's been over 2 million Palestinians in peril in Gaza now. Um,
Mhm.
Also, the UN has said that Gaza is facing the highest levels of food insecurity ever recorded. And famine is just around the corner if it's not it's already happening. Over 20,000 Palestinians dead, and the number will keep on growing. There's blockades for food and support. Um, and people of Gaza are systematically being starved and bombed. Like that's just the facts. Like
It's there.
it's there,
It's
and it's there's a systematic blockade around making it very difficult for any international help to also come in.
Yes. I mean, yesterday I was listening to this interview with somebody from the UN, and they were saying that trucks had been turned back because they had water filtration systems in them. You have 2 million people that don't have access to drinking fresh water. The numbers of the World Health Organization are there. The numbers of people with acute diarrhea, with dehydration in Gaza are there. They're in public knowledge. Why would you turn down a water treatment portable unit that could get fresh water to, I don't know, 5,000 people? I think we should be flooding Gaza with water treatment systems. We should be flooding Gaza with food. And what is food aid? I mean, again, there was an interview earlier on this evening with a lady that had 6 children with her, and they were getting 3 bottles of water and 4 or 5 canned food give outs every couple of days. And she was saying that lasts us less than a day, and it's given every like 4 or 5 days. Is it because aid is being? I mean, you know, we've seen how the narrative is being done. When there was people who attacked trucks that had food on them, it was trying to be used to say, "Oh, but we shouldn't let more aid in because aid is not arriving to its beneficiaries." Well, I'm sorry, you starved 2 million people, and Antonio and I are being starved, and we're at the border where that truck comes in. I do think it's a normal, natural instinct to try and grab whatever is on that truck and feed our families. It's like the whole arguments that are being put forward to make aid arrival to Gaza more difficult just don't make sense. How can anybody still think that this is not genocide? Like, as you said, they're facts. We're not putting emotions, political beliefs, just facts. The facts are being reported by the international institutions, which we all agree as humanity, and our governments across the world agree that those are the objective organizations put in place from 1921 onwards, from the League of Nations and the UN onwards, to regulate somehow different topics, i.e., the World Health Organization, the UN, OCHA, etc., all the UN bodies. We've seen countries condemned across in our lifetime. If we take Libya, Iraq, I mean, that have been condemned for breaching the UN Charter, for breaching the international conventions, whether it's the Genocide Convention, whether it's the Geneva Convention for Warfare. There are internationally agreed upon mechanisms that are supposed to be there to make us, humanity, live in safety and security.
Yeah.
The exception and the impunity that's been given to Israel over 75 years leads to this. It leads to a regime today that thinks it is above and beyond any of those international legal frameworks that were ratified, for some of them, by Israel also. I can't be saying we have to stop killing of the Palestinians and try and justify what happened on the 7th of October. It's not like, again, it rejoins what humanity is about. The horrors that were done by Hamas, by other factions, by other people that came out into the Israeli communities are there. That's also something we shouldn't tiptoe around, I think, because we're seeing also today some form of horribly cold and disgusting measure of horror. And you feel in the narrative that's being put forward and the stories being put forward of people trying to say, oh, but we've suffered more. It's like, I'm sorry, but as a human being, there's nothing called I've suffered more. There's people that are dying, people that have been killed, people that have been maimed, people that have been brutally tortured. It's there. It's there on, it's happening. It happened. The Second World War, if you look at it as, good versus evil is something. But if you look at it as a human perspective, there was millions and millions of people that lost their lives, regardless of their, origin.
Mm-hmm.
And the Second World War did not only happen in Germany and France; it happened as far as Japan and as south as Northern Africa. We as humans should learn from these things, because that sentence of never again should be never again for humanity. We've seen politicians use the anti-Semitism to shut down voices that are critical of what's happening.
That is, before we move on, that has become a major narrative, at least here in the States as well, where any critique of the Israeli government can be seen as anti-Semitic. So there is now like this fear that I sense from people that it's probably best just to not say anything and to just kind of stay on the sidelines, um, because either their 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 occupation could be jeopardized, they could be criticized online, they could, whatever it is. And now we have such a strong state of social media that anything could be misconstrued and without context.
And we've seen this cancel culture that is turning voices of people, as you said, into fearsome voices, because nobody wants to be alienated from their work. Nobody wants to be alienated from their. And there has been heads that have rolled, sadly. We've seen it in academia. But I think a lot of people, across the world, that studied American contemporary history and culture and literature were also heavily influenced by the anti-Vietnam War voices, because that was a boiling moment of creativity. That's where you had the beatniks. It was the end of the beatniks. It was the beginning of a hippie generation. There was a lot of liberated voices in the US. And today you're seeing those people being silenced, or the descendants of that thought being silenced in places like academia, where actually, if you look at human life, let's say you're doing a BA, the only 4 years of your life where you're free to explore and express are those 4 years of campus. Because then you're going to have a job and you will not have the time to be exploring the whatever, the Renaissance arts or whatever it is that you have a fantastic system with all these electives that allow you to explore bits and pieces of culture. And seeing that today we're trying to force a monolithical approach to political science, to humanitarian values, to critique, it's like, wait, did we just like literally with a swipe of a pen cancel 1955 to 2000 everything that was acquired by all types of civil rights movements, whether it was African American civil rights movements, whether it was anti-war movements, whether it was LGBTQR movements, like all of that's been like swiped away.
Yeah.
People that were critical of radical communism and the Soviet state were demonstrating for and against. People that were critical of the use of napalm in Vietnam were demonstrating. Like, I am stunned by either the total ignorance of people or the voluntary ignorance of people.
This is a moment for the world to educate themselves, and we're just like in the political uprising in 2020 in America, the social unrest, the Black Lives Matter movement. It was a wake up call for everyone to learn. And
Yeah.
these are things that have been happening for generations. And it's okay if you've just arrived and you're like, I didn't know, you know? There's a lot of people that are just like, I didn't really understand what this history was or what was happening. Can you just describe a little bit of what was life like before this conflict in Gaza?
So I'll just start by commenting on what you said about it's okay to join now and start learning. Look, since a couple of years, when I talk to people, I realize that even people that are Palestinian in the diaspora don't necessarily understand or know what it is to be living here. And it's okay. It's okay because living here is abnormal. You're not expected to understand it. It's not it's not anything that anybody can imagine, and therefore you're not expected to be sitting in Iowa and understand what it means on your daily life. So To make it simple, there's four types of Palestinians living in Palestine. There is Gaza, which we'll look into more in detail. There's the West Bank, there's East Jerusalem, and then there's Palestinians in Israel. Whether we like it or not, 1948, the division of the country, then 1967, the occupation of the rest of the country by the Israeli forces, 1987, the first Palestinian uprising, the first Intifada, people shake with civil unrest, shake the occupation, which leads to the Oslo Agreement. And I wanted to start with Oslo to explain what Gaza is today. So the Oslo Agreement was an interim agreement that was signed between the PLO and the State of Israel. It says it's an interim agreement for 5 years. And at the end of those 5 years, there should have been a final resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian situation. What happened is the first return of the Palestinian government in exile, the PLO, was done in Gaza. And it was Gaza and Jericho first, then the rest of the West Bank. And Gaza itself so Gaza is, the strip of Gaza, had Israeli settlements in it. It stayed until 2005. And the most densely populated place in Palestine and among the most densely populated in the world. Why? Because a lot of the people living in Gaza and the other towns in the Gaza Strip are people who are refugees from the 1948 Nakba and the 1967 Naksa. So both times where Israel expelled Palestinians from their original homes. In 2005, because you will hear a lot of people say that Israel was not occupying Gaza. What is true is that in 2005, Ariel Sharon forced the Israeli settlers that were in Gaza to leave Gaza. And there was this dismantlement of Israeli settlements in Gaza. It does not mean that it stopped being occupied. And that is very important to understand. So access to Gaza could happen through Israeli checkpoints at the entrance of Gaza, notably Erez checkpoint, which is the largest checkpoint that led into Gaza, through the sea, logically, but that was not allowed. Israel's warships do not allow you to use the sea, except for fishermen that are allowed, I think it was 5 nautical miles at the time of fishing. And then there's a small portion of Gaza South Rafah, which today is being used to let aid in, which is the border with Egypt. And Hamas won the Palestinian, because again, that's a lot of misinformation being used. Hamas won the elections that were done in 2006, parliamentary elections in the West Bank and Gaza, which were supervised by the Americans and the Europeans, who wrote a report saying the elections were transparent and democratic. Hamas ended up in parliament, formed a government, and the world decided to boycott the Palestinian government formed by Hamas. There was a civil strife/war between Fatah and Hamas in Gaza, and Hamas won that fight. So Hamas were in charge of Gaza, but we're in charge of what in Gaza? So when we saw images in the beginning of the war of the Israeli troops conquering the Hamas parliament, in reality, it was not the Hamas parliament. It was the Palestinian parliament that was built most probably with EU or US money when there was a unity of the Palestinian government, which then, after the takeover of Hamas of Gaza, ended up being used by Hamas. When we've seen images of a takeover of the Ministry of Information, it is not the Hamas Ministry of Information. It is the Palestinian Ministry of Information that was being run by Hamas in Gaza. So when Hamas took over, Israel imposed a blockade on Gaza. It's been going on for 17 years, 16 years. But before that, and people again don't understand this, they think that before that the borders were open. Not true. Since Oslo was signed and the Palestinian Authority was given control of Gaza, the West Bank, bits and pieces of the West Bank, not even the whole West Bank, Israel built those checkpoints and controls around Gaza and around the West Bank. So you couldn't import food, for example, into Gaza or export food. Gaza does some of the best oranges and strawberries and dates in Palestine. You don't just export out of Gaza. So this whole idea of there was food security before the 7th of October and it's the bombings that have made it insecure, that's not true. There has been, since the beginning of the blockade, so for the 16 last years, a list of produce that are not allowed into Gaza and a regulation of what produce is allowed out of Gaza by the Israeli authorities. That includes things like chocolate was not allowed into Gaza. So the chocolate would come through Egypt from the south sometimes. More importantly, people were not allowed movement in and out of Gaza except a few that would be given permits to leave by the Israeli authorities, or in the south by the Egyptians. But what you have to remember on the Egyptian border, because we've also heard a lot of BS. It's not the Egyptians alone that control the border. The border was always subject to an Egyptian, Israeli, and Palestinian authority control, because the borders were still, on the Palestinian side, were still managed by the Palestinian Authority that's based in Ramallah, not by Hamas. And then Hamas added another layer of control. So you had all these so for a regular citizen in Gaza, you couldn't get out of Gaza. You couldn't really come back to Gaza. And then sometimes there would be openings so you could come in and out and travel abroad. Like it could happen, and it does happen. It used to happen. But now that we're looking at the figures, we see that prior to the 7th of October, there was something like 500 trucks allowed into Gaza of commercial goods. Commercial goods means everything. Means food, means building material, means clothes, means the whole commercial goods. Today, what's being allowed in terms of aid is something around 100 trucks when aid is allowed in a day.
In all of Gaza?
All of Gaza. So
There's 100 trucks
allowed in of aid into Gaza right now. What is that going to impact people's hunger? What is that going to get in terms of medical supplies? It's not 100 trucks that is needed to be allowed in. If in normal times it was 500 trucks, it should be 1,000 trucks today. Because prior to the catastrophe that's happening to Gaza, some people in Gaza farmed, some people in Gaza worked in factories. You had food accessibility also produced in Gaza, which today is not the case. Fishermen were not allowed in deep sea, but they were still allowed a few nautical miles, so they still could fish a bit, not enough, but they could still. So there was really sources of food. I was there. Gaza produces, like the last time I was in Gaza was in 1987. And I remember one of our relatives taking us to his orange groves, literally on the sea. Of course, those were burned down since the 7th of October. But, there was oranges planted in Gaza. Gaza is a very fertile land of sand and red soil. So the land would grow beautiful stuff. The dates of Gaza are exceptional. Today, all of this is gone. So it's not only we need to get enough aid to replace the 500 trucks. It's the 500 trucks plus everything else that was produced in Gaza. Um, the the tragedy of it is, imagine a miracle happens and there's a ceasefire now as we speak. How long is it going to take before people in Gaza can go back to living, not even normally, to living as they were under an open air prison? Because prior to the 7th of October, there was not enough fuel getting into Gaza. We all heard of the power plants failing to produce enough electricity, which means the desalination plants were not working correctly to have fresh water into Gaza. We've heard all the stories of sewage water from Gaza being released inside the sea because the treatment plants were not being able to work all the time. Everybody in Gaza who had a home had either a fuel generator or some form of solar energy, not as a luxury. It's because they did not have running electricity 24 hours a day. People do not understand when we talk about the livelihood of Palestinians that neither in the West Bank nor in Gaza before the attacks do Palestinians have access to running water all day. Something you would take for granted in the US because your house is connected to a municipal distribution network. You open your taps, you have water. Often, when people come to Palestine, they look at our homes and say, "Oh, but why'd you have water tanks on the roofs?" And it's because people store, whenever there's water, we store it in those tanks, and then we use that water until we get water being supplied to us again, while noting that that water is coming from our aquifers, from our own aquifers occupied by Israel, controlled by Israel.
You're in Bethlehem now, Fadi?
I'm in Bethlehem, yes.
So
I'm
this
in
applies to you.
Bethlehem. This applies to me, yes. This applies to me. This applies to every Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza. We don't, like the water pipe from the municipality is fed water from our own reserves that are controlled by Israel, and where we are fed less water than the Israeli settlers in the West Bank. It applies to me at the restaurant when the restaurant was open prior to COVID. In summer, we used to buy water, i.e., get a water truck to come and fill our wells because we did not have water in the municipal pipe coming in. So I had to worry about this when my equivalent chef in the US was worrying about did they have a bad food review. This is like, it's a small example that is so essential. And then, of course, I feel even guilty of complaining about this today compared to what's happening in Gaza, where people have no drinking water anymore. Neither the fuel, nor the water, nor the food that was going into Gaza was going in free of charge. That was being paid for.
It was being paid for by the people.
The fuel was being paid for by the Palestinian government, and then, of course, inside Gaza, when it was sold, being paid for by the people, Water is being paid for by the people. Food was being paid for by the people. People need to try digging deeper and understanding what are the components that led to this. What is, and when I say led to this, because people have been often trying, as you said well earlier, um, people have been twisting words. When I say led to this, is led to this whole situation. I'm not in any way justifying the actions of the 7th of October. I agree with everybody else that it has to be seen within a context. It does not mean that it makes it less horrible or it makes it less unacceptable. But we live in a context.
Right.
I mean, imagine a small town in America if you wouldn't have running water for 35 to 40 days in summer. Don't you think the citizens of that small town will not be happy, to say the least? Uh,
There for sure be a revolt.
there'll be a revolt, definitely. And regardless of political color,
Yeah.
everybody would be in the streets. The Palestinians have been living with this for 75 years. What I found also very disturbing in the last 90 days is that whole attempt to have Palestinians totally dehumanized or to ask Palestinians to prove their humanity. It's like, wait,
Yeah.
I am human whether you like it or not. I don't need to humanize myself.
We're seeing Palestinians having to just defend themselves over just to exist, to survive.
You know, Palestinians in the diaspora are having to spend a lot of their energy just to go on being Palestinian. Like Palestinian chefs and bakers and what have you in the US and Canada and elsewhere are being subjected to horrible smear attacks. And it's like, wait, but that person sells sandwiches. Like, why are you having a go at that person? What is disturbing in what they're saying or what their existence? Palestinian poets are being silenced. Palestinian, it's not, and very few. If you look at the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, if you look at the stances of a lot of Palestinians, very, very few people have justified the actions of Hamas on the 7th of October. Despite that, we're being asked every time we speak to any media, do you condemn the Hamas attacks? How many Israelis that spoke to media were asked to condemn the massive killing of Palestinians in Gaza? None. But also, there's this whole layer of racism that's
Mhm.
being applied to Palestinians in the sphere of even the coverage of the victims. We're seeing very little of the stories of people.
Yeah.
We're seeing these images of horror, but we're not seeing but who were those people? This, you know, of course, I realize there's no way you can cover 21,000 stories in any media wherever, but who were those people? For me as a chef, what were those people eating?
Yeah.
What, when a few days ago, a friend of mine in Gaza posted a picture of the first two eggs he managed to eat in 91 days. To be honest, it had me cry for an hour because it's something you or I can take for granted. Open our fridge and crack two eggs. It took 91 days for that person to be able to find two eggs. Like,
But how are you doing? How are you, and what is the feeling in the West Bank as well?
look, in Bethlehem specifically, I can talk about Bethlehem more because I am in Bethlehem. Um, Bethlehem is a city that depends on tourism. From the moment the 7th of October happened, tourism stopped in the city. So, in a small city, you have 7,000 people that have lost their jobs and their incomes. Then you had something like 10, 12,000 people that worked as construction workers within Israel that have also lost their jobs. So the city is facing, so basically Bethlehem and the region of Bethlehem is around 200,000 inhabitants. So 10% of the population has lost its income. 10% of the population losing its income means all the basic shops losing also their income, i.e., your supermarket, your butcher, your the vegetable farmers on the market, etc. Then we all have friends and family in Gaza. Everybody is totally obsessed with what's happening in Gaza. Um, there has been, since the beginning of 7th of October, but way before, increased settlement activity. The Israeli settlements are being built, settlements are being expanded, but also there's been a lot of settler violence in the West Bank against Palestinians. 2 months ago was the olive picking season. We've seen whole areas where people decided not to pick their olives because they were afraid of attacks by Israeli settlers. How am I? Look, I haven't been able to cook, honestly, for since the beginning. I've forced myself to cook recently. I'm also very, very confused because it took me around 2 years to do my first cookbook. And my first cookbook is ready to go out in May. So we announced its launch two
Uh,
weeks ago.
Which is
And it was,
called Bethlehem, a celebration of Palestinian food.
yeah, but it was extremely difficult to even announce that it's up for pre-sale because I felt it wasn't the right time. But it's something that's been done. Like, publishing is not a fast-moving um, industry. It had been planned. It's already being printed. Like, I had to announce it, and there's this whole confusion of should I go on cooking? Should I go on trying to write new recipes? What do I do with what's here? So what's here is Fauda, my restaurant that had been closed since COVID. We were planning on opening for Christmas. We didn't open for Christmas, of course. Um, I did open a small boutique hotel in partnership with a Palestinian Chilean family, small luxury, 6 rooms. We had opened in April. October, November, December were the first months we were supposedly working. We were fully booked for 3 months. Of course, we have had zero customers for 3 months. So and again, all of this sounds very futile in the face of mass murder that's happening in Gaza. But it's a confusion of all of that. Um, and I get to a point where there are days where I feel extremely hopeful when I see humanity in movement, when I see that there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of voices across the world that are demanding that this ends. Um, what makes me hopeful is that these voices are extremely diverse. because that is the world I would like to live in. I was asked recently by a journalist, "What's your dream for this place?" And I said, "Look, my dream would be to be able to drive my car, which I don't have. I'm very happy I sold my car 10 years ago. But anyway, drive. It's a dream. My car to my family land in Jaffa that was dispossessed in '48. Open the grill with my keys to the orange grove, pick an orange, and share it with my friend Kike, who happens to be Israeli, and my friend X, whoever from the north of historic Palestine, so north of Israel today, who's been dispossessed in '48, and not care that Kike is Jewish and that person is Muslim and that person is Israeli or Palestinian. It's I think we're at a point where this cannot go on. This cannot go on for the good of humanity. Yes, for the good of the Palestinians. Yes, for the good of the Israelis, but also it cannot go on for humanity. It's obvious that displacement of people from their lands, mass murder of people from their lands, will never lead to anything good.
No. I want to thank you so much for, taking the time with me. And one,
Thank
what I'm hopeful is at the very least for this to be a moment where people around the world will be inspired to be even just informed, to be educated. Just to be informed is at the very least that I hope that this is what comes out of this, because we could
Yeah,
use the power of whatever you have access to, even if it's just your family, one other person. I'm not even saying you all have to say something on social media, because we all have our own way of processing and making a difference in our own lives. And I want to lead to end with you mentioned that you were kind of questioning whether you want to continue to cook, and I hope you do, Fadi. I want you
I will.
I
I will.
I want you to keep on cooking, man.
I will. I will, Antonio. I will. It's just, you.
And listen, before you answer this, I just, as because I know you're an artist. Food is your art. Cooking is your art. That's your passion. That's how you, I know this. You process the world through food. You process what's
True.
happening and your own feelings.
True.
I'm the same way with storytelling, filmmaking, creativity. That's how I could only process what's happening in the world, is through an artistic lens. And I do it for myself, and that's how I could express myself to the rest of the world, and that's how I put in my own effort to say something, whatever it is. But it's also a personal endeavor, that's how I just deal with it. That's just how I deal with horror. That's how I deal with joy. Anything, it has to be through an artistic lens. And I know you're the same way with food. And
True.
in that book, sell the shit out of this book, man. Like, promote it. This is your lineage. This is these stories. I'm such a proponent of storytelling.
It's
Any
stories, Antonio. The book is stories. Okay, it's recipes, but it's also stories. I literally, it's. I mean, the book for me is as if you came to Bethlehem. I'll take you by the hand and tell you my Bethlehem. I battle, with. I spend time thinking of, I don't want to do this. I can't do this, and then I force myself. And I think that the moment that I really had was in December. So I've been very much influenced by my late grandmother, in my cooking, in my social engagements. Like, she was a very strong figure there, and she basically stole a Betty Crocker fruitcake made it into the most Palestinian fruitcake for Christmas possible. So she threw out all the dried fruits that had nothing to do with the region and replaced them with dates and figs and dried apricots to the core. And that cake has become like a very strong family tradition, but also like because she was very involved in the society, she would bake like hundreds of them on the 1st of December and then give them out on the 24th of December. And it like became very symbolic also because she would give them out to whoever was there, and that was beyond faith. So it was not like it was a Christmas cake that was given out to Muslims and Christians and Jews and atheists and whoever. Like it was beyond anybody's thing. And when she passed away, I decided to continue that, at least baking the cake for the family. And then sometimes I'd feel I had more energy and do that for the restaurant for Fauda. But and this year, from the 1st of December, I was saying, I have to do it, I have to do it, I have to do it. And I couldn't get myself to do it until I remembered that so I have an aunt who's originally from Gaza, who lives here. She still has family there. But like I remembered that when my grandmother did those cakes, she would also keep a few aside and tell me, those are not for Bethlehem, those are for our relatives in Gaza. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, I'm not going to allow anybody to break that cycle. And so on the 24th, sorry, on the 23rd evening, I spent the whole night up baking those cakes. And I did give them out, okay, not to Gaza, but to the family here, including my aunt from Gaza. As you said, it's important for things to change. People are educating themselves. That's how I rationalize the book right now. And I do hope that people who will open it and look at it and see that my mother's blonde. God, there are blonde Palestinians. There's actually a story about her there. She doesn't like it. I showed her the pictures yesterday. She was like, I don't like that. But it's like I think like literally that image just came out to my brain. It's like I imagine having heard so much ignorance on social media over the last few months. I think there's a lot of people that are going to be shocked the shit out of their brains because there's a blonde Palestinian mother and there's a recipe for pork. We eat pigs in Palestine. Imagine it happens. Like, we're laughing about it now, but it's so sad.
I know.
I feel it's so sad for people that are so ignorant.
History matters. It's the stories, it's
Of
the
course,
humanity, it's how we continue to move on, it's how we keep our culture, it's how we share. It's that's what I loved about getting into the food industry. I didn't get into the food industry because I just love to eat. I cared because every ingredient, every dish, you look past it and it tells the story of a people. Like it tells the history of a culture. And I like when I hear you talk about even like your book, I could completely understand why that's important, because you're telling these human stories of the people that matter to you. And these stories, and even the way that we're talking right now, that creates empathy for one another. And instead of just always reading the news headlines or the stats of any sort of conflict, dig deeper. You start to
yeah,
kind of question. Context is everything. It's
of
everything,
course,
And
of course.
so you know, I, I can't wait to read that book, your book specifically, Fadi. And I
I,
also,
I can't wait to have you cook those recipes.
oh my God. And then we'll do another video and I'll show you what I created.
Cool. Antonio,
it,
thank you.
it was such a pleasure, Fadi. And I hope one day we will sit together in person and share a meal
We
together.
will. We will. I'm sure we will somewhere.